Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Garry Disher has published 60 titles across multiple genres. His best-selling crime novels have been recognised with 4 German and 3 Australian awards for Best Crime Novel of the Year, and Garry's been longlisted twice for a British CWA Dagger Award. In 2018, Garry received the Ned Kelly Lifetime Achievement Award. Today I'm joined by Garry Disher to talk about the 5th novel in the Hirsch series, Mischance Creek. Garry, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thanks, Greg.
Paul Hirschhausen is the only cop in Tiverton. He's a true community cop. He knows what's going on. He checks the community Facebook page. He's thorough. He's responsible. He maintains a keeping tabs list. And he's very much the humanitarian. Welfare checks are just as much part of his responsibility as are firearm checks. In many ways, Hirsch is an ordinary person with ordinary and predictable habits. Is this the cop, the character you first envisaged when you set out to write the Hirsch series?
Yes, he pretty much is the same guy. The first Hirsch novel, Bitter Wash Road, was meant to be a standalone, but 2 or 3 years went by and Hirsch was tapping me on the shoulder wanting more stories, and so I set about writing more, and this is the Mischance Creek is the 5th one. I wanted to do 2 or 3 things with this series. Firstly, in most crime fiction, the main investigator is senior in some way, an inspector or a sergeant, superintendent even, with a team working under them. But Hirsch was just a lowly constable. So that introduces an element of tension I can explore in the novels where he's butting up against senior officers often. The other thing I wanted to do was, in most crime fiction, the main character is firmly rooted to place. They grew up there. Like if you take Hieronymus Bosch in the Michael Connolly series set in LA, he grew up there, he knows the place, he knows how it works. Hirsch is a city guy. He's under a cloud, he's sent to the bush, to an officer police station. So he's running 2 investigations, if you like. He has to work out the circumstances of a crime he might come across, because often he's the first responder if it's a suspicious death. And the second investigation is, what makes this place tick? How can I fit in here? What are these people like? How do I settle in? How do I make myself accepted? I suppose, too, I'd been a bit tired of reading particularly American crime fiction in which the main character has a dark secret of some kind, a drug habit, or they're a boozer, or there's the threat they'll go back onto the booze, or some other dark stuff. But Hirsch is just an ordinary bloke. He's got fallibilities. He's doesn't always do the right thing, but generally he tries to do the right thing. He, as you use the word humanitarian, and I think that's right. And I think that's the role of a country cop. They do have to look after the lonely widow who lives on a back road, who might be forgotten by everybody else. In the novel too, there's 2 teenagers in town who are the carers for their bipolar mother, and but at the same time, there are crimes that he has to explore, solve, whatever it might be.
Does Hirsch's backstory as a whistleblower, exiled to a one-cop station in South Australia's Wheatbelt, which began in Bitter Wash Road, does that still inform who Hirsch is?
Less so all the time. As the series progressed, he would occasionally come across other cops who knew his story and would give him the cold shoulder or be abusive in some way towards him or wouldn't trust him even. But he's been there a few years now, and I think he's proved himself to the people he comes up against, the senior officers and fellow cops. So it's less of an issue for him now, although I can still see potential there perhaps for a future novel where the past comes back and bites him.
Hirsch seems to have earned the trust of the citizens of Tiverton, and he's made an effort to fit in.
Country policemen have to fit in. The world of him comes from 2 sources. One is my brother, who was a country cop. He's a bit like my father with the Second World War, the stuff he won't talk about. But I was able to see him operate as a country cop because we grew up on a wheat and wool farm in this area. And he's very useful if I got a research question. I ring him up and say, Russ, is the back of a paddy wagon air conditioned or not? That kind of thing. He's good on that. But I do also had a sense of his community role. But also, when I first started writing the series, I read a long feature article with a country policeman, a sergeant in a remote area of Victoria, up in the mountain country. And I had a very strong sense of his social responsibilities, his sense of community, of trying to belong, because it helps his job. If he doesn't join the tennis club, if he doesn't make friends with anybody, if he doesn't pop in for a drink at the pub, um, it's going to make his job much harder as a country policeman.
You have a great eye for detail, and that's reflected in Hirsch's own eye for detail too. Yet your story still proceeds with economy. The plot is always moving forward.
I think there are two things that have influenced my writing. One was that early in my career, for many years, I just wrote short stories, sent them off to literary magazines. And I learnt there to be economical, that every word counted. And I learnt to uh, write between the lines, if you like, that the writing suggests a greater depth, if you like, or whatever it might be. So there's that. So I'm a very plain stylist. The other thing that happened was that I won a creative writing scholarship to Stanford University in California early in my career. The scholarship doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but a few Australians went over a period of maybe 10, 20 years. Um, and I thought I would jump in the deep end and gave a short story to be workshopped in the very first week of the class. There were 12 of us, and we'd workshop stories and novel chapters every twice a week. And it was a simple story about a young woman going into a pub and seeing her ex-boyfriend on the other side of the bar. It's an internal monologue. By the end of the story, she's decided, no, she doesn't need to hook up with him again. She doesn't need to go and say hello. She's moved on from there. And that it's just a subtle shift, and that's fine in a short story. But I gave it to the class and they pulled it apart. And someone in the class whose opinion I trusted said, your writing suffers from sensory deprivation. And so I took her to the pub and asked her what do you mean? And she said that good writing makes pictures in the head. She said, that story is in your head, but it's not on the page yet. It's not in the reader's head. She said, I don't know if she's tall or fat or thin or brown haired, i.e. sense of sight. I can't hear the jukebox in the corner. I can't taste the salt on the pretzels. I can't smell the cigarette smoke and so on. So what she was saying was that if you can appeal to the reader's senses, if you can get them to hear a sound or see the light quality or a whiff of smoke in the air or whatever, it brings them closer to what's happening. So it was a really, really useful writing lesson for me. Um, so now I don't want to beat the reader over the head with too sensory overload, but I try to hint at things so that they're there with Hirsch.
The town of Tiverton, it's much like any other rural town, the descriptions of landscape and the conditions under which people live, drought-stricken. But what sets it apart, I suppose, what creates its individuality, are the characters, the people that live there. Like Hirsch, each of them has their own backstory. Is that what creates a more satisfying portrait of a town in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think we don't live in a bubble. So I like my characters to be aware of of a wider world for a start, political issues that might be affecting most Australians, that sort of thing. So there's that level of it. But also with these townspeople, and some of them crop up in book after book, like the shopkeeper, for example, who's a bit of a grumpy old bugger. I try to give a sense that there's more to them than that they have another story behind them. It helps flesh them out, but it helps give a greater sense of a town that's not populated with cardboard cutouts, but real people.
Another of those characters is Trent McRae, a self proclaimed sovereign citizen. He seems to be a man of these times.
There are some things that grab my attention, and I might do research on them over several years, like the growth of the far right. I've been cutting out newspaper clippings and reading about that for many years now, and I realized that the sovereign citizen movement post-COVID paralleled it in some ways. I think they share some of the same beliefs, but the sovereign citizens are just a bit nuttier. So, but I've been reading about them ever since COVID. I'd had a sense of their frustration that life's not working out for them, and they look for answers elsewhere, i.e., in the internet. And there's a class of thinking that says society's laws don't apply to you. You know, you're a sovereign citizen. You're not a citizen of Australia. That you don't need to have a driver's license. And for a long while, I thought they were nuts, just crackpots, you know. But there was certainly a groundswell, a small groundswell that they were getting bigger. They're getting more vocal. Some of them involved in other sorts of activities that I explore in the book, i.e., the role of local councils and bylaws and taxes and all those sorts of things that they say that none of it applies to them because if none of these things apply to them, it makes life easier for them, but not for the police, of course. And the police are at the coalface. They're the ones who have to deal with them first before the courts do. But it's got a lot darker. If we take Desi Freeman, for example, he's shot dead two police and wounded a third, and he calls himself a sovereign citizen. Reading in The Age recently that a lot of lawyers, magistrates, and judges are getting threatening letters from sovereign citizens and outbursts in court as well. So it's something I'd been following, knowing I could use it somehow or other someday. Just at the same time, I'm following the role of some of the fundamentalist churches, some little churches that pop up, sometimes in rural areas. And I'm wondering, and I've been reading those sorts of stories for a few years now, wondering how I can use that maybe in a Hirsch novel. I'm interested in, undercurrents in society around me, I suppose. But the story has to come first. I don't want to beat the reader over the head with a message.
There are also characters that don't quite fit the country culture. Vicky Bastian was originally a country girl, but now no longer feels she fits in.
Yeah, she's a recurring character. We've seen her in three or four of the books now. Yeah, she's, I suppose if you could say there's an upper class, rural upper class, that's where she comes from. Her father's a stud merino breeder. She went to a private school in the city, but she went to a primary school when she was little. So she feels those country roots. Then she goes away to college, learns to be a teacher, comes back to teach in the rural area, and realizes that she's moved on, and so her primary school friends, that there's a greater likelihood that they are married now with children and perhaps struggling in life. Maybe they've rented out a spare bedroom for hairdressing or whatever it might be. She's also a victim of her good looks. She's seen as a bit of an ice queen, a bit of a snob, but Hirsch has in many ways has taken her under his wing. He's helped her out of a couple of tough spots, particularly to do with parents. And that's another thing I like reading about. I've read quite a few stories now and spoken to teachers about abusive parents. So that's Vicky's backstory.
Probably should mention Annika Nordrum, who's searching for her mother's body in Anna Gorge. She's already lost her father, and this is the beginnings of perhaps some sort of cold case for Hirsch.
Yeah, he gets a call one day that there's a motorist in strife in the very dry country. So he goes out there to rescue her to see what's happening and thinks that initially that it's just a tourist who's driving around in an unsuitable vehicle and learns that no, this woman, before Hirsch arrived here, her parents, who are gold and precious stone fossickers, got into strife. Her father's body was found at the bottom of a mine shaft. Her mother's body was never found. And there's all kinds of theories cropped up as a result. Her mother was having an affair and murdered her husband and ran off and all those sorts of things. But so she's had to deal with this for years. And now she's in a position where she can spend a few months or a few weeks, whatever it is, to go back to that country, because she's convinced her mother's body is there, and she goes looking. So, and Hirsch finds himself intrigued by the case and digs out the old records because one of his predecessors would have looked into it, and realizes that the original case a lot of shortcomings. They believe right from the start it was just one of those terrible outback accidents and didn't look any further. So he does a bit of research on the sidelines. But of course, without giving too much away, that case reverberates all through the novel and comes to a head at the end.
You're a best-selling novelist. One thing that I found quite interesting in reading your biography is that you've won several Deutsche Krimi Prizes, most recently in 2017 for the first Hirsch novel, Bitter Wash Road. Have you contemplated your popularity in that sphere?
I'm still a bit astonished at the popularity of the books in Germany. I've made 4 author tours of Germany now, on bestseller lists there, and won those awards. I've often thought about the appeal of the books. The last author tour I did, so a few years back now, Jane Harper's The Dry was everywhere. So I think German readers there's the exotic appeal of the Australian bush compared to the closely settled green world that they live in. So that's part of it. The Germans are a great reading society. Books matter and bookshops matter. They're open to books from other countries, whereas I still think there's a bit of a block in many Australians that if it's a translated book, or I don't know if I want to read a translated book, so I'll go to the old favourites, the bestseller from the United States or the UK. But the Germans are open to literature from other countries, and my Wyatt books were popular there first. And a German academic explained it to me once. He said, German society is very well-behaved, well-mannered, polite, law-abiding. But Wyatt, if you don't know my Wyatt novels, he's a professional hold-up man, banks and payroll vans and so on. And so Wyatt's his own man. And I think he said they find that appealing. I was also told at every author tour I made that Australia is apparently teeming with snakes and spiders. I have to tell them that most Australians go 3 or 4 years without seeing a snake, and house spiders are just mild little things up in the corner of the ceiling.
Going back a bit, you've also written non-fiction books with a focus on Australian history, 2 about bushrangers. Were these books and the research that goes with them somehow foundational for you?
They were in the sense of helping me think of myself as a writer. I had done a master's degree in Australian history at Monash, and someone I met along the way as an associate editor with Oxford Uni Press said, we're going to launch a new series of history textbooks for high schools at sort of junior level. And so I wrote 2 books for them, one on the bushrangers and one on daily life in Australia during the Second World War. And I had a writing deadline and all those sorts of things. It's a different way of writing, though. In history, the answer is there at the start, and your task then is to explain how we got to that point, if you like. Whereas fiction is quite different. Everything's unknown until the end. Quite different way of writing and thinking, and it depended on a lot of research too. But I had those research skills because I did this master's in Australian history at Monash, so I knew how to look for stuff in the War Memorial or State Archives or whatever it might be. But it was very early in my writing career. My first book was a book of short stories, and then a few history textbooks. So it made me feel like I was a writer, a proper writer, and I was getting a proper income from these books too, unlike my fiction, which either sank without trace, or I might get a free copy of the little magazine that a short story had appeared in that took me 2 months to write, that sort of thing.
You've approached the crime or crime fiction equation from different sides in your work, through the Hal Challis and Detective Ellen Destry police procedural novels, in the Wyatt series, which you mentioned before, which follows the exploits of a professional thief and burglar, and now in the Hirsch series. There must be a good deal of cross-fertilization in your crime writing. Does that help create new pathways for you in your writing?
Not necessarily new pathways, but yeah, one will enrich the other, I think. Sometimes I don't know who Garry Disher is. With one book, I'm a master thief, and the next book, I'm part of a team of police. The next book, I'm a semi-retired sad sack ex-homicide officer, as in Under the Cold Bright Lights, my novel. So they're all aspects of me, I suppose. I think in terms of an investigator and a perpetrator, a team player and a loner, they're all there.
Garry Disher, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you.
I've been talking to Garry Disher about the 5th novel in the Hirsch series, Mischance Creek. It's published by Text Publishing, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.